I thought I'd just start my talk off. Someone mentioned to me I need to start off with a bit of an icebreaker. And I thought this video, it's a cue for upstairs, would be quite fitting given the topic of this conference, but also some of the things that Ian was mentioning this morning. Now, a few of you probably have heard about mythical beasts such as bunyips. Not sure if you're aware, but their birthplace was in southwest Victoria, on the Waterway River, and they've even got a pub named after them. But I don't think many of you have heard about the Glenelg River monster. Now, there's been lots of old-timer stories, particularly from anglers, that have gone down the river and almost been taken by this mysterious beast. And there's also been stories of native wildlife going down to have a drink and being taken by this monster. And of course, a lot of these stories go that there's been no captures and, of course, no photos taken until more recently. We had one of our staff members go out a couple of months ago and managed to get this on film. Now, I'm pretty convinced that this is the Glenelg River monster. There you have it. There was another reason why I wanted to show this. This is actually one of our key species that we're focusing on with our restoration project. It's the Glenelg River spiny crayfish, which is an endangered species. But I'll start talking about the project. So the project is in southwest Victoria. It's a 12,000 square kilometre basin. The work that we've been doing has been focusing on the Glenelg River, working from near Rocklands Reservoir up in the north, working our way down the river progressively till we get to the estuary mouth down there at Nelson. So that's about 350 kilometres in length. We've also been working on a lot of the tributaries that run into the river in the upper subcatchment, but also more recently on the Waterway River, which is a major tributary that flows into the Glenelg River. So the Glenelg the headwaters start in the pristine Grampians and finish up down there at Nelson, also quite pristine. However, the bits in the middle aren't so good. A lot of past land management practices has resulted in a lot of erosion, and a lot of this sand has washed its way down into the river. This is actually the greatest threat to the Glenelg River, this sand, which is accumulated in the waterway, and it's progressively making its way down towards the estuary. Problem with that is that basically all that sand smothers all the habitat and all the in-stream vegetation in its path. We had a lot of desnagging that occurred back in the 1960s and 70s, and of course that took away a lot of that habitat for a lot of our important fish species. Other key issues for the river are pest plants and animals, particularly carp, which are a recent introduction, and blackberries and pine wildlings are our major weed species that we're tackling. And then you've got river regulation, of course. So back in the 1950s we had Rocklands Reservoir constructed. And that had some pretty significant impacts on the river, particularly during the droughts in the 1990s and early 2000s. But we had a number of cease-to-flow events in the river, and the river was in pretty dire shape and was pretty much resorted to a few isolated stagnant pools of water. So enter the Glenelg River Restoration Project. So it's a landscape scale restoration project focusing on an entire river system. I usually do this talk and it takes me, I usually have 10 key lessons, so I haven't got time to talk about the entire project today. So I'm just going to focus on what I think are the top 3 lessons that we've learnt from this project. Number 1 is the importance of good planning and engagement. So we've actually got a waterway strategy that sets the priorities for priority reaches within our region, but it doesn't get into the detail, and the detail we get into with our waterway action plans. So these water action plans we undertake at a subcatchment level. We focus on all the properties within that subcatchment that have a waterway, which is shown there in orange. We then assess these properties, look at all the assets. Assets could be like drought refuge pools, threatened species. We have look at the threats. It could be erosion or rabbits or foxes, weeds. But we collect this information at that subcatchment level, but all the way down to individual properties. And that's shown here on this map. So this is a landholder map. We provide this map to the landholder, has all the information on the assets and threats on their properties, but also has a list of prioritised management actions that they can undertake to address those threats and protect those assets. We then invite them to a community presentation where they can learn how they can get incentives to undertake those works on their management plans. And then, of course, they implement the management actions in conjunction with us. One of the key learnings from doing these water action plans over the last 6-7 years has been what we've found that they're really good at actually being able to direct investments to the most important threats and assets. Prior to doing these WAPs, we were pretty only getting probably 25% of our works on priority waterways. Now with this approach, we're getting about 85%. So one of the big partners with this project has been working with the landholders. We've had 659 families or farming families that have worked with us on this project over the last 14 years. And they've been working with us through what we call our partnership program. So this is where we provide 50% of the costs to the landholder, usually in the form of materials, and their 50% contribution is usually in the form of labour. We've found with this approach, it's been able to increase ownership over the site, and they're more likely to maintain the project in the long term. But also, with our overall bucket of funding, it means we've got more money to go on the ground to other projects. But another key learning from doing these action plans is they're not just a good planning tool, but they're also a really good engagement tool. Because we're going into a given area, we're stimulating a lot of interest. We're talking to all the landholders within that area, so they start talking to one another. They even get to the point where they sometimes compete with one another to get the bigger projects. So we've found that prior to doing the WAPs, we were only getting probably 19% of uptake on average for our projects. And now that's around 45%. So nearly half the landholders we talk to or visit want to do works with us. So I get on to the implementation side of things. So through these action plans, we've been able to, in conjunction with landholders, fence 1,725 kilometres. So that's a fair amount of fencing. Just to give a bit of an eye, put it in perspective, that's a distance of 2.4 trips between Melbourne and Adelaide, which is shown there on that map. So all the pink on that map are the projects that have been undertaken over the last 14 years. The other benefit of doing the WAPs, you can see the green here on the map, and this one here. We can also collect information on projects that the landholders already undertaken themselves. So we collect that information, and it starts creating a bit of a picture or a story within each of these subcatchments. So with all that information, we now know that 85% of this subcatchment is now protected from stock from the waterway. So we can just go in and focus on those key gaps. A lot of trees have been put in the ground with this project, over 500,000 trees and almost 800 kilometres of direct seeding. And a lot of weed control as well, particularly blackberries and pines, which are a real issue in this landscape. Sometimes the fencing and revegetation alone isn't enough to combat that erosion. So we need to actually construct hard erosion control structures like rock chutes. Second point is demonstrating outcomes. And this goes without saying, we all like to be able to demonstrate outcomes with our projects. We've been able to demonstrate a few outcomes with this project. The one I wanted to focus on today is our fish barrier removal. So we've removed 12 fish barriers with this project, which has opened up almost 1,000 kilometres of waterway to fish, which they previously didn't have access to. This is really important for fish that like to migrate between the estuary and the freshwater as part of their life cycle, such as the tupong, one of these species. So we've been monitoring this species since 2009. It's a standardised technique used right across the state called the Victorian Environmental Flows Monitoring and Assessment Program, VEFMAP. So each year we go to these same sites, which are shown there in pink, and we survey for a number of species, but I'm just going to talk about the chupong today. The section at the bottom there, the blue area of the river, is currently, or at that point in time, accessible to the chupong. The section in red to the north is inaccessible because of a fish barrier right there in the middle. So little fishies down there, they're the chupong. So we had, so I'll go back one. So we only had one record in the first year, 2 in the second year, a couple of quiet years. In 2013, there's a lot more flows in the system. So naturally we've got quite a lot more chupong at our sites. However, you'll notice even with those increased flows, they still weren't going north or beyond that fish barrier. We had the fish barrier removed at the end of 2013. And we had them going all the way up 210 kilometres further north of their previously known location. They haven't been recorded this far north since back before the 1950s. And a similar story now going up the Wannon River. We're starting to get them right up the Wannon system and up near Hamilton. But one other thing we've learnt with this project is not just to focus on demonstrating environmental outcomes. You heard the talk about, Kelly mentioned it before, an increasing need to start talking about the benefits, or economic and social benefits from our works. And probably the best example through this project has been the sand extraction component of this project. So we've been working with sand extraction companies to directly take that sand out of the waterway. Sometimes there's so much sand in the waterway that you really physically need to get down and remove it before it becomes a real issue. And there's wins for the environment too, because it creates instant habitat holes for fish. But then you've got all these other bonuses too, like you're creating jobs for a sand extraction company, you're improving recreational fishing opportunities and they're great swimming holes for the locals, and also supporting local tourism. So, for example, at Casterton, which was one flat sheet of sand before these works, now the locals are starting to notice a lot of people stopping by the river, and it's creating a lot more tourism opportunities for the township. The difficulty though, as Kelly mentioned, is trying to quantify that, finding that cause and effect relationship. My last point is about selling your project. And as Ian mentioned before, it's about selling those positive messages from your projects too. Now, one thing, in terms of we won the River Prize for this project, and we probably wouldn't have won the River Prize if we hadn't actually taken the time to go back and have a look at what we've accomplished in conjunction with our partners over the last 14 years of this project. And I think, particularly management agencies, we don't often take the time to stop and have a look back on what's been achieved. We kind of always looking at the now and looking forward. But I think it's really important that we actually take the time to reflect and have a look back, because that's when we can actually look at or find out what are those outcomes that we can demonstrate, and that we can then communicate those benefits to the wider community. One thing we also found that works quite well for us with this project, in terms of trying to sell this project as a whole, is looking at something that we think we can do quite well, or find a bit of a niche, something you can hang your hat onto. And one of those things has been this waterway action planning approach. So we kind of use that to try and sell our whole project. And now it's the effect where we actually get invited to conferences to talk about this waterway action planning approach, even conferences overseas. So I just to suggest to consider, if you've got a similar project out there, and I'm sure you've got projects just as good, if not better than this project, but maybe just take the time to stop and have a look back on what's been achieved. If you think you've got a really worthwhile project to talk about, then try and gather that evidence, and maybe apply for awards, go to conferences to talk about your restoration project. Because you might find it might pay off dividends too, like increase your profile and maybe bring in more funding for your project. Which leads me to my last point, is a good way to actually try and sell your project too is to look for people who are quite influential to try and help sell that message or support your project. And that could be a local a minister or a celebrity, because they can actually help increase your profile and funding for your project. For example, I just wanted to show you this example. A couple of years ago, we got the former Premier Dennis Snapthine on board with this project, really tried to sell the project to him, to the point where he helped support the nomination of the Lower Glenelg for Ramsar status. And had we not worked with Dennis and the department on this, I don't think we'd be where we are today in getting this site listed and putting all the documents together, because it's a huge step in the process in terms of getting the site listed for Ramsar. So just to recap, the top 3 lessons: importance of good planning and engagement. So your planning can actually help you direct investment to the most important threats and assets, get better bang for buck, but also it can be used as a really good engagement tool to try and increase uptake with your restoration project. Importance of demonstrating outcomes, so setting up some good monitoring and evaluation systems before and also that monitoring program during your projects is really important. And of course, as I just mentioned, the importance of trying to sell your project and getting that message, those positive messages out there about your project. Thank you.